Where? Where?
Right here, sir. Yes, sir, over there.
Where? What the f***? We are talking The Blackwater Vampire from 2014, and this one is directed and written by Aaran, and this is a found footage movie about, you've guessed it, a vampire. Now the story is very similar to that of The Blair Witch, probably the most well known out of the kind of found footage films. It follows a small group of four who are trying to make a documentary on this kind of guy who was put in prison on death row for killings of various kind of women, but they believe that he's innocent as there's no real tangible evidence to suggest he had done it. So they basically try and kind of go out to this kind of remote area, which is this sort of snowy wilderness type place, to try and interview locals, find out what has happened, and try and prove this guy is innocent. And of course, as the title suggests, they run afoul a vampire. What will happen? You'll have to watch the movie and find out. So let us discuss what I think works in this movie. So this is kind of like an old-fashioned found footage movie. It very much follows the early days of when kind of found footage became kind of popular, following very closely the kind of the template that kind of the Blair Witch kind of set out. I know the Blair Witch wasn't the first found footage movie, but that's really the movie that popularised the kind of the format. So that's kind of what I'm referring to. So what works in this movie? Okay, so a number of things. I think first and foremost, the effects of this creature are standout. It's actually very, very impressive. Now, with a lot of found footage movies, and this one included, we don't see a whole lot of this kind of creature, but we do see, the last 20 minutes or so, you will see a reasonable amount. And when you do, I think it's very, very impressive, particularly the actual first shot where you actually see the kind of the creature hanging upside down of a tree. This is a kind of a full-size kind of like dude in a costume, obviously. It looks really, really impressive, I have to say. And we get, a reasonable amount of shots within that kind of last 20 minutes showing you the kind of the prosthetic work, and it looks pretty scary. Yet the vampire here is depicted as more of a feral animal than kind of a sentient kind of human style kind of vampire, which gives it this kind of dangerous kind of feel. You feel this is like a real predator that you can't kind of like talk to. It's just an animal really more than anything else, and has this kind of ferociousness because of that. So that was all quite good. I really enjoyed this kind of wintry, snowy setting. Now I always think when you have this kind of this snow on the ground and you have a horror film like Blood in the Snow, and it kind of looks very kind of dynamic, because you have this kind of the snow which is kind of pure and white, and then you have blood and kind of as a contrast. It just kind of looks like a really cool setting. It gives the impression here that our kind of crew of four people are really out in the wilderness, and obviously having to deal with some pretty bad weather as well. I mean, there's a couple of sequences here, if we're being picky, where it kind of looks like they're not too far from civilization, let's say. But, for the most part, I think the illusion is there. I have to say as well, I think the acting is pretty solid in the movie. I think all the cast here do a pretty good job. I mean, they're not stretched beyond their means necessarily, and the kind of the script follows the kind of the tried and tested kind of formula of found footage, as I've mentioned. But I think the cast all do a pretty good job, and even the guy who is kind of like the typical kind of a-hole, if you like, until his very final scene. I don't think he's being completely unreasonable, if I'm completely honest with you. I think he's, although he is the more antagonistic one, I don't think he's, as I say, looking at it from his point of view, I don't think he's being necessarily unreasonable until he's kind of like his final sequence in the movie. And I gotta say, I think this movie does have some interesting subplots and things that are introduced. I was quite intrigued about this kind of the serial killer, or the guy that they've got for these kind of murders. And there is a short sequence where he's interviewed in prison. He's played by really the only recognisable name here, Bill Oberist Jr. And, you know, I was thinking, oh, are they going to, you know, it's quite an interesting kind of aspect to it. Are they going to manage to prove that, you know, this guy was you know, potentially innocent and what his deal? And there's some interesting kind of things going on with the kind of the townsfolk. And then there's a kind of another element that's introduced kind of later on. So what doesn't work in this movie? This is going to be slightly spoilery. I'm going to be as vague as I possibly can. But this will be ever so slightly spoiler. But it is a 2014 movie. Okay. So before we get into that, I think the most obvious problem with this movie is it's just so similar to the Blair Witch Project. I mean, a lot of movies have tried to ape Blair Witch, but this one really follows the exact same story beats as the Blair Witch Project. You know, we have these kind of group of young people filming, going into this kind of small town, interviewing the kind of like the locals and kind of finding out what's happened. The middle kind of section, you know, is fumbling around the woods, finding all these kind of occult symbols. We have the sequence where they're in a tent and something's pressing in, you know, on the tent from the outside. Then we have the kind of the reveal of the more supernatural stuff as the movie kind of concludes in its third act. So it really does, you know, you substitute witch for vampire and it kind of feels like it's more or less the same movie. The only real difference here is I think they do a little bit more with the physical kind of vampire here than the Blair Witch. And there's a couple of other smaller elements that are involved, the kind of the spoilery things, which I'll touch on in just a minute. So there was that. What else before I get into the kind of the spoilery bits? There's a little bit of a use of CGI, which is a little bit obvious. I would say there's two shots really that I kind of noticed. One of which I think is relatively kind of well hidden because it's in the dark, but one is a little bit more obvious. I don't think it needed it, but I don't think it's quite as you know, as obvious that it's going to kind of ruin the movie necessarily. There's one shot which is clearly kind of CGI, and I don't think they needed to do it, but it's a couple of seconds, not a huge kind of deal here. The movie is somewhat of a predictable kind of story because it follows the template set by the Blair Witch so kind of closely. It's a pretty obvious where this kind of movie is going to head. And there's the spoilery elements that I'll talk about, and again I'm going to be as vague as I can, is there are some elements here that are introduced that I don't know work particularly well. So there's a sexual element involved here, which is kind of introduced late in the kind of the film, which leads into the kind of the final scene. Now the sexual element, I don't know if it really needed that, if I'm honest. And then that leads me to the final scene, the final like shot in the movie, so to speak, which I thought was a little silly. Again, it's something that was kind of, it kind of brings up questions, and I think it was a little bit silly. Again, that's just kind of the spoiler bits I want to go. And then we have the kind of what's involved in with the townspeople here, and it kind of it leaves you some questions, and it's like the guy who's in prison for these kind of these murders. I was thinking, well, was he involved, or did he get shafted by the sort of townspeople who are maybe complicit at the very least? There's, you know, again, there's a few kind of questions there where I feel it kind of opens the door, but doesn't kind of really go full way through. So you're kind of left with a few kind of unanswered questions. So the movie itself, I think, is a pretty solid, if not spectacular, found footage movie. Very much following the template set by the Blair Witch Project, and that doesn't really, you know, veer too far away from a kind of a tried and tested formula. But what we have on screen, I think, is solid. The mystery is interesting. I think even before we get to our creature, it has some interesting angles that the movie kind of like peters in, albeit I don't think it particularly fleshes it out too much. And then the actual creature itself is very impressive. So I will give this one an above average score, albeit I don't think it's like as good as the kind of the real top tier found footage movies. But I would say this is an above average movie for its kind of budget and type. So it's a 6 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment, and I shall look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.